The rain hammered against the rusted windows of Blackridge Station, turning the old train depot into a cage of echoes and shadows. Inside, the private security contractors laughed loudly around a metal table littered with empty coffee cups and rifle magazines. Their expensive gear gleamed under the fluorescent lights: carbon fiber rifles, thermal optics, laser sights worth more than most people's monthly salaries. Then the door creaked open. An old man stepped inside slowly, leaning slightly on a wooden cane. His grey coat was soaked from the storm, and water dripped from the brim of his faded military cap. Slung across his shoulder was an old bolt-action rifle wrapped carefully in cloth. One of the younger guards snorted. "You lost, Grandpa," he called out. "Museum tours across town." The others chuckled. The old man ignored them. His pale blue eyes scanned the station calmly before resting on the range supervisor, a broad man named Curtis. "I'm here for the long-distance lane," the old man said quietly. Curtis frowned. "What, with that thing?" He pointed toward the wrapped rifle. "You know this isn't some history convention, right?" The old man slowly removed the cloth. The rifle beneath it was old walnut and blued steel, worn smooth by decades of careful hands. A Winchester Model 70. Ancient compared to the tactical rifles surrounding it. One contractor laughed outright. "Man, that thing probably fought dinosaurs." But the old man's expression never changed. "My name is Walter Hayes," he said calmly. "I reserve the 900-yard lane." Curtis looked down at the booking tablet and frowned again. "Wait. Lane 9. He looked back up skeptically. "You're the shooter?" Walter nodded once. A heavily tattooed contractor leaned back in his chair. "You sure you can even see 900 yards, old-timer?" More laughter spread across the station. Walter simply rested one weathered hand on the rifle stock. "I've seen farther," he replied softly. Something about the way he said it caused the laughter to weaken slightly. Curtis sighed dramatically. "Fine. Your funeral." He pointed down the hallway. "Lane 9. Waivers mandatory." Walter signed the form without complaint. His handwriting was steady. Precise. The contractors exchanged amused glances as the old man walked toward the isolated lane at the end of the building. None of them noticed the scar running along the side of his neck. None of them noticed the faded insignia stitched into the inside of his coat. And none of them knew that 48 years earlier, men in 3 different countries had whispered his name like a ghost story. Back then, they had called Walter Hayes something very different. They called him the Raven of Khost. And in the mountains of Afghanistan, entire enemy platoons had learned to fear the sound of a single rifle shot echoing through the snow. Lane 9 sat alone at the far end of Blackridge Station, separated from the others by thick concrete walls. Most shooters hated it because of the distance. 900 yards demanded patience, discipline, and skill, things many modern contractors preferred replacing with technology. Walter Hayes stepped inside without a word. The overhead lights buzzed faintly as he laid his old rifle case on the bench. Outside the reinforced glass, rain blurred the distant steel targets into grey shadows. A young employee named Mason followed behind, carrying a spotting scope. He couldn't have been older than 23. "You really planning to shoot that thing at 900? Mason asked carefully. Walter opened the rifle case. Inside rested the Winchester Model 70 like a sacred artifact. The walnut stock was dark with age, scratched by years that no polish could erase. The scope mounted on top looked ancient compared to the glowing digital optics everyone else used. Walter gently checked the bolt. "Yes," he answered. Mason hesitated. "No offense, sir, but most guys miss at this range even with modern setups." Walter gave the faintest hint of a smile. "Most guys rush." He removed a small leather pouch from his coat and placed 5 cartridges onto the table with careful precision. Each brass casing gleamed softly beneath the fluorescent lights. "Hand-loaded. Perfectly measured." Mason watched curiously. "You make those yourself?" Walter nodded once. Since 1968. Back in the main lobby, Curtis and the contractors watched through security cameras mounted above Lane 9. The tattooed contractor laughed. This is gonna be painful to watch. Another man crossed his arms. I'll give him one shot before that shoulder gives out. But Curtis noticed something strange. The old man's hands didn't shake anymore. Not even slightly. Inside the lane, Walter slowly lowered himself into position behind the rifle. Every movement was controlled. Familiar. Like muscle memory carved into bone. The station around him faded. The rain disappeared. And suddenly, in his mind, he was somewhere else entirely. Snow whipped across jagged mountains beneath a black sky. Frozen wind tore through torn camouflage. Somewhere in the distance, Soviet helicopters thundered across the valleys. Walter blinked once. The memory vanished. He adjusted the rifle scope calmly. Mason glanced toward the target monitor. 912 yards, he muttered. Wind's rough today too. Walter looked at the distant steel plate through the old scope. Then he whispered quietly, almost to himself. Wind never bothered me much. He chambered the first round. The metallic click echoed sharply through the empty lane. Back in the lobby, several contractors smirked and gathered around the monitor screens, waiting for the inevitable miss. Curtis folded his arms. All right, Grandpa, he muttered under his breath. Show us what you got. Walter exhaled slowly. Then the rifle fired. The sound was not loud like the modern rifles. It was deep. Heavy. A sound with history behind it. The shot rolled through Black Ridge Station like distant thunder. Several contractors in the lobby glanced up instinctively. Even through the concrete walls, the old Winchester carried a weight modern rifle somehow lacked. Mason immediately leaned toward the spotting scope. For a second, he said nothing. Then his eyes widened. Hit, he whispered. The steel plate nearly a kilometer away still swayed from the impact. One clean center strike. Back in the lobby, the tattooed contractor scoffed. Lucky shot. Curtis nodded slowly, though something about the impact unsettled him. Inside Lane 9, Walter calmly worked the bolt. Another cartridge slid into the chamber with smooth mechanical precision. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Mason kept staring at the old man now. Up close, Walter didn't look fragile anymore. The years were still there in his lined face and silver hair, but beneath them sat something harder. Something disciplined. Like an old wolf resting after a lifetime of surviving winters. Walter adjusted slightly against the stock. The rain outside intensified, hammering against the reinforced windows. Wind readings on the digital screen fluctuated wildly. Even experienced shooters struggled in conditions like this. Walter fired again. Boom. 3 seconds later. Clang. Another perfect hit. This time the contractors in the lobby stopped talking. Curtis frowned at the monitor. No way, one of the younger shooters muttered. Walter cycled the bolt again. Mason finally gathered enough courage to ask. Were you military? Walter stayed silent for a moment. Then he answered quietly. Long time ago. What branch? Walter's eyes remained fixed downrange. There weren't branches where they sent us. Before Mason could ask another question, the third shot fired. Boom. Another direct hit. Now people were leaving their lanes. One by one, contractors drifted toward the security monitors, their expensive rifles hanging forgotten at their sides. The old man never acknowledged them. His breathing remained slow and even. Inhale. Exhale. Squeeze. The fourth round struck even closer to the center than the others. Mason stared in disbelief. That grouping's impossible. Walter finally allowed himself a faint smile. Nothing's impossible, he said softly. If you survive long enough to practice. The words carried no arrogance. Only truth. Back in the lobby, Curtis noticed something else now. The old man wasn't just shooting accurately. He was compensating for the shifting wind before the computers updated. Like he could feel the air itself moving. The tattooed contractor swallowed nervously. Who the hell is this guy? No one answered. Inside Lane 9, Walter's expression slowly changed as he looked through the scope again. Not fear. Not anger. Memory. For a brief moment, the steel target vanished. Instead he saw a snowy mountain ridge beneath a burning sunset. Saw frightened young soldiers trapped below enemy fire. Heard radio operators screaming coordinates through static. And beside him in the snow rested this exact rifle. 48 years ago. Walter blinked hard. The memory dissolved. Only the target remained. He loaded the fifth and final round. Mason noticed the old man's hand gently brush across the rifle stock, almost affectionately. Like greeting an old friend. Then Walter whispered something so quietly Mason almost didn't hear it. This one's for Daniel. The rifle fired one last time. And somewhere far downrange, metal screamed. The final shot rang out through Lane 9 like a distant artillery blast. For a moment nobody moved. Then Mason leaned into the spotting scope again and his entire body froze. The far steel plate was still vibrating violently, but this hit was different. The center was gone. Completely gone. The bullet had punched straight through the thick steel target, leaving a jagged hole where the bullseye had been. Silence filled Black Ridge Station. Even the constant buzzing of the fluorescent light seemed to fade. The contractors staring at the security monitors looked as if they had just witnessed something impossible. Curtis slowly lowered his arms. That plate is half-inch steel, he murmured. Nobody answered. Inside Lane 9, Walter Hayes carefully opened the rifle bolt and removed the spent casing. His expression never changed. He cleaned the weapon with slow, deliberate movements, completely unaffected by the stares now gathering behind him. Mason finally found his voice. Sir, who was Daniel? Walter paused. His weathered hand rested against the old Winchester for a long moment before he spoke. The best man I ever knew. His voice was quiet, but there was something heavy inside it. Something old. Mason hesitated. Friend. Walter gave a small nod. Spotter. The single word hung in the air like smoke. Before Mason could ask another question, the main entrance door of the facility opened hard against the storm outside. Cold rain blew into the lobby as three men entered wearing dark coats. One of them was immediately recognizable even to the civilian contractors. Ethan Vale, retired Special Forces commander, holder of multiple Silver Stars, and one of the most respected military figures in the country. Even the cockiest shooters straightened slightly when he stepped inside. Curtis quickly walked forward. Colonel Vale, sir, we weren't expecting. Then Vale stopped walking. His eyes locked onto the monitor above Lane 9. He saw the target. He saw the rifle. And then he saw Walter. His face went completely pale. Impossible, he whispered. One of the men behind him looked confused. So. But Vale had already started moving. He walked quickly toward Lane 9, his every step sharp with urgency. The crowd parted without a word. Walter looked up just as the colonel entered the lane lobby. For a second neither man spoke. Then Colonel Vale quietly removed his gloves. His voice was barely above a whisper. Raven. Mason looked between both men in confusion. Walter stood slowly, his old bones creaking softly. He studied the colonel's face for a long moment before a faint recognition appeared in his eyes. Lieutenant Vale, he said softly. The colonel's jaw tightened like he was fighting emotion. Dear God, you're alive. The room stayed completely silent after those words. You're alive. Nobody understood what they were witnessing anymore. The contractors who had mocked Walter earlier now stood frozen beside the walls, staring at the old man with growing unease. Even Curtis looked nervous. Colonel Ethan Vale slowly stepped closer into Lane 9, his eyes locked on Walter Hayes like he was seeing a ghost rise from the grave. Walter rested one hand against the rifle case. "Been a long time, Lieutenant." Vale gave a weak laugh under his breath. 48 years. Mason looked between them carefully. "You two served together?" The colonel's expression darkened slightly. "Served," he repeated quietly. "No. Men like me survived because of him." Nobody moved. Rain hammered against the windows while the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Finally Curtis cleared his throat awkwardly. "Sir, who exactly is he?" Colonel Vale looked at the younger men surrounding him. Most wore expensive tactical gear. Some still had rifles hanging from slings across their chests. Yet suddenly they looked like children pretending to understand war. Then Vale spoke. In 1978, deep inside the Khost Mountains, an entire reconnaissance unit disappeared behind enemy lines. His eyes never left Walter. Officially, the mission was classified. Unofficially, we walked straight into hell. The room remained dead quiet. We were surrounded 3 days after insertion. No air support. No extraction. Temperatures below freezing. Vale swallowed slowly. 21 men trapped inside a valley with nearly 400 enemy fighters closing in. One contractor muttered softly. "That's impossible odds." Walter said nothing. Vale continued. "We lost communication on the second night. By morning, most of us were wounded. We knew nobody was coming." The colonel paused for a long moment before speaking again. Then the shooting started. Mason felt chills crawl up his arms. "One rifle," Vale whispered. "Just one." Every 30 seconds another enemy soldier dropped. Nobody could locate the shooter. The mountains echoed too much. Curtis stared at Walter now. Vale's voice became heavier. For 17 straight hours he covered our retreat alone from a frozen ridgeline. Every time enemy forces pushed closer, another shot stopped them. Walter looked down quietly at the Winchester resting on the table. The enemy started calling him the Raven because they never saw him. Only the bodies. Nobody in the room laughed anymore. Nobody even breathed loudly. Then Vale revealed the part that truly shattered the silence. When rescue helicopters finally reached us, his voice cracked slightly. Walter Hayes was still on that mountain with 3 bullets left and severe blood loss. The colonel looked directly at Curtis. "He saved 21 lives that winter." Then his gaze shifted toward the ruined steel target hanging downrange. "And apparently he still remembers how." The weight of Colonel Vale's word settled over Black Ridge Station like heavy smoke. 21 lives. 17 hours alone on a frozen mountain. The contractors standing near the lobby no longer looked at Walter Hayes with amusement. Now they watched him carefully, almost cautiously, like men standing too close to something far greater than themselves. Walter seemed uncomfortable with the attention. He quietly closed the rifle case and reached for his old coat. But Vale stepped forward quickly. "Wait." Walter stopped. The colonel's eyes carried decades of unfinished memories. "You disappeared after Khost," Vale said softly. "Nobody knew what happened to you." Walter adjusted the strap on the rifle case. "That was the idea." Curtis frowned in confusion. "You just vanished." Walter nodded once. "War ends differently for some men." Nobody answered that. Rain continued pounding against the windows while distant thunder rolled across the city outside. The entire range felt strangely smaller now, quieter somehow. Mason finally asked the question sitting in everyone's mind. "If you were that good, why didn't anybody know your name?" Walter looked toward the ruined steel target far downrange. "Because the dead don't care about medals." The sentence hit the room harder than any rifle shot. Colonel Vale slowly removed one glove, revealing a faded scar running across his palm. "You saved my life twice," he said quietly. "The second time was after extraction." Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. Vale continued. "I was ready to go back over there. Angry. Stupid." A faint humorless smile crossed his face. "You sat beside me in a field hospital for 6 straight hours and convinced me not to throw my life away." Mason listened silently. "You told me surviving was harder than dying," Vale said. Walter gave the faintest nod. "Still true." One of the younger contractors shifted uncomfortably. For the first time all night, nobody cared about expensive rifles or tactical gear anymore. Because standing in front of them was a man who had lived through the kind of violence movies could never truly capture. Curtis swallowed hard. "Sir," he said carefully to Walter. "I owe you an apology." Walter looked at him calmly. Curtis lowered his eyes. "I thought you were just some old guy trying to relive the past." Walter surprised everyone by smiling slightly. "In a way," he admitted, "I was." The room stayed silent again. Then suddenly one of the contractors near the back stood straighter and raised his hand in a respectful salute toward Walter. Another followed. Then another. Within seconds, nearly every man in Black Ridge Station stood silently saluting the old sniper. Walter stared at them in complete surprise. His tired eyes shifted slowly toward Colonel Vale. The colonel simply nodded. Not as an officer. Not as a superior. But as one soldier honoring another. Walter Hayes stood motionless beneath the harsh fluorescent lights while the room of hardened contractors saluted him in complete silence. For a moment, nobody moved. The storm outside rumbled across the dark sky, rain streaking against the tall windows of Black Ridge Station. Somewhere in the building a ventilation fan hummed softly, but otherwise the range had become completely still. Walter slowly lowered his gaze. His expression carried something deeper than pride. Regret. Colonel Vale finally lowered his salute first. "You know," he said quietly, "half the men from Khost still talk about you like some myth." A faint tired smile crossed Walter's face. "Stories grow larger than truth." Vale shook his head immediately. "Not that one." Curtis stepped forward carefully. "Sir, what really happened up there?" Walter was silent for several seconds. Then he rested one hand on the old Winchester rifle case and answered. "We got trapped." His voice was calm, but every word felt heavy. "The valley froze overnight. Snow waist deep. Radio destroyed during the mortar attack." He paused briefly. "Enemy fighters knew we had nowhere to go." Nobody interrupted him. Walter looked past them now, like he was staring through time itself. "We moved the wounded into a cave system before sunrise. Lieutenant Vale wanted to stay behind with me." Vale gave a faint laugh. "He threatened to knock me unconscious if I refused extraction." Walter's eye softened slightly. "You were 19. The colonel smiled sadly. "And stupid." A few quiet chuckles spread through the room, breaking the tension for only a moment. Then Walter continued. "The helicopters couldn't land because of the storm. So I stayed behind to buy time." Mason swallowed hard. "Alone?" Walter nodded once. The young employee looked genuinely shaken now. "How did you survive 17 hours against hundreds of fighters?" Walter looked down at his scarred hands. "Training," he answered first. Then after a pause. "And luck." Colonel Vale shook his head again. "No," he said firmly. "Not luck." He turned toward the others. "You want to know why enemy forces feared him?" Vale asked quietly. "Because Walter Hayes could stay completely still for hours in sub-zero temperatures. Because he could calculate wind without instruments." His eye shifted toward the ruined steel target. "Because at 800 yards he never missed twice." The contractors exchanged uneasy glances. One finally muttered softly, "Jesus." Walter seemed uncomfortable hearing it. "I wasn't special," he said. Vale immediately answered. "Yes. You were." The room fell silent again. Then Mason noticed something. Walter's hands had begun trembling slightly. Not from fear. Not from age. From exhaustion. The old sniper slowly sat down in one of the chairs beside the lane wall. For the first time all evening, he suddenly looked every bit of his 89 years. Colonel Vale noticed too. Without a word, he pulled another chair beside him and sat down. Two old soldiers. One forgotten by history. The other still carrying its medals. And between them on the table rested the rifle that had carried both men through hell. The cafe inside Black Ridge Station was nearly empty by midnight. The storm outside had finally weakened, leaving only soft rain tapping against the windows. Most of the contractors had gone home hours ago, quieter than when they arrived. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody bragged about gear or shooting records. Because none of them would ever forget what they had witnessed in Lane 9. Walter Hayes sat near the corner table with a cup of untouched black coffee resting between his weathered hands. Across from him sat Colonel Ethan Vale. And beside them, laid carefully across the table, rested the old Winchester rifle. For a long while neither man spoke. Old soldiers often understood silence better than words. Finally Vale leaned back slowly. "You know," he said quietly, "they still teach modern sniper doctrine using reports from Khost." Walter raised an eyebrow slightly. "They do?" Vale nodded. "There's an entire section military instructors call Raven theory." A faint smile crossed his face. "Precision under impossible conditions." Walter looked down into his coffee. "They gave it a fancy name," he muttered. "Back then it was just survival." Vale studied him carefully. "You ever regret disappearing?" The question lingered heavily in the air. Walter sat quietly for several moments before answering. "Every man leaves part of himself in war." His tired eyes drifted toward the rain outside. "Some of us just leave too much." The colonel didn't argue. Because he understood. Outside the cafe window, Mason stood silently for a moment before finally walking away, giving the two veterans their privacy. Earlier that night he had searched Walter Hayes online. He found almost nothing. No medals. No interviews. No photographs. Only one declassified military file mentioning an unidentified marksman during the Khost extraction of 1978. Unknown status. Presumed dead. Mason looked back one final time through the glass. Walter Hayes sat quietly in his chair, looking less like a legendary sniper and more like an exhausted old man finally putting down a burden he had carried for nearly 50 years. And somehow that made the story even greater. Inside the cafe, Colonel Vale slowly stood. Walter looked up. The colonel extended his hand. "For what it's worth," he said softly, "I never forgot." Walter stared at the offered hand for a long moment. Then he took it firmly. Not like heroes in movies. Not dramatically. Just two old soldiers bound forever by a frozen mountain and the terrible cost of survival. As Vale walked toward the exit, he paused near the doorway. "Oh," he added with the faintest smile, "the contractors already renamed Lane 9. Walter frowned slightly. "What did they call it?" Vale opened the door, cool night air drifting inside. "Raven's Ridge." For the first time all night, Walter Hayes truly smiled. A small quiet smile. The kind earned only by men who survived history long enough to become part of it.